So my name's Karen Smith. I teach international relations at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, but I'm originally South African. And the reason that I'm at this conference is that I served for 2.5 years as the special advisor to the Secretary General on the responsibility to protect. And so that was also what my speech was about today, essentially just outlining the basics of responsibility to protect, or R2P, because a lot of people, I think, don't really know what it's about. So they use the word without really understanding, the origins of it, what are some of the misconceptions. It's difficult to pinpoint a particular time, a time or an event or an incident, but I guess because I'm South African, it kind of comes with the territory, right? I mean, we had an apartheid system for a long time, which was obviously a gross violation of human rights, also, of course, considered a crime against humanity. And so when I was in high school, when I was a teenager and then a student, it was around the time when South Africa was the end of apartheid was essentially happening at that time, and we were going through the transition and the negotiated settlement. And so I was kind of active then as a student in terms of the elections. So I was an election observer. I was very interested in politics. I was studying political science. And so that's, I think, how I started becoming interested in the issues. And then following South Africa's transition to democracy, I also did some freelance work for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was essentially how do we move on from decades, if not centuries, of segregation and discrimination.
Wow. And
I came because I wanted to eat the food in Seoul. No, I mean, I think it's so important. I mean, I'm no longer working as the UN Special Advisor on R2P, but of course R2P has a special place in my heart and always will. And so even while I was working for the UN, I think I always was pushing for states to champion this important principle. And often the criticism would be that, oh, it's only Western states which take this principle seriously. So I was really encouraged by the fact that, an NGO in South Korea saw the kind of potential in it. Because I think that's essentially what it's about, right? To say, well, this is actually an instrument that people who are suffering human rights violations can actually use to hold governments accountable. So I have to be honest and say that I didn't know much about the situation in North Korea, except for the kind of the basics, which I think most people know. So I found today really illuminating, and so I thought the speech by James Heenan of NKHR was really interesting in terms of labor issues, right? So forced labor, and that's something which I guess I knew about but didn't really think about explicitly. But I think it's difficult to highlight just one issue. I think there are so many. I mean, something which wasn't really mentioned today, but which I've read about, is really the discrimination against women. So that's something which I think is very serious.
Agreed.
I think it's a tricky one, and I've had interesting conversations with people because, of course, you get the kind of two sides of the continuum, right? On the one side, you get people who say, well, you have to take a kind of hardline approach, so, coercive sanctions, threats, etc. And then on the other side, you get people who say, well, we have to keep the dialogue open, we have to keep, engaging with the North Korean government. And it seems like neither of those really has worked in the past. So I think it's kind of trying to find this sweet spot in the middle. And I'm not exactly sure what that is, but I think and when we see the really small advances that have been made in the past, I think it's where there's some engagement, but then there's also the idea that there's some expectation from the international community to kind of say, well, if you take this step, if you improve your situation in some way, then this is what you will get out of it. So kind of a give and take. But I think it's about really small incremental steps. Say pillar one, but that is of course the responsibility of the North Korean state. And I think, so ultimately that is the ideal, that's what one would move towards, that the North Korean state actually feels that it's responsible to protect its own citizens. But given that that's not the situation, probably isn't going to be in the foreseeable future, I think pillar two is probably a really important one. Pillar two is really all about international assistance, but I think we can understand that in a kind of broad sense. So assistance in the sense of saying, well, what I've just said, a kind of trade-off to say, well, we would like to help you improve your human rights situation, and in return, perhaps, we can offer the following. So I think that's, pillar three, people think about that. And of course, part of that is also things like negotiation, mediation. I don't think military intervention is at all an option for the North Korean situation, but some kind of diplomatic engagement, I think. So perhaps a kind of mix between pillar two and pillar three. To look at an example that really speaks to North Korea because it is so unique. But I think if I think of successful R2P examples, two off the top of my head come to mind in the African context. So one was in Kenya with the the violence around the elections in 2007, 2008, where we saw the international community, regional actors, and also national actors actually taking a stand and working together. So I think that's also really important, that you have this interplay between regional, so in this case, South Korea as a neighbor as well, but others in the region and the international community working together and kind of in coordination to try and effect change. And the other one is the Gambia, which few people know about, but that is also a really interesting case where we saw the sub-regional organization, ECOWAS, really stepping in. And this again becomes interesting then, because before the Security Council actually authorized the use of force, they sent in military force essentially to try and calm the situation down. And that was also really important in preventing what people thought would be large-scale atrocities in the government. Where do I start? This is, I think somebody mentioned today that the R2P is seen as very state-centric because ultimately it's something that was adopted at the UN. It speaks about, the responsibility of governments. But as somebody else said, and I completely agree with that, it's not something that states can do on their own. And so when we see, again, where the work is being done on the ground that's making the change, especially in terms of prevention, it's all civil society driven, right? So it's all happening from the bottom up. Sometimes you see that states will have a position at the UN that's actually maybe against R2P, but when you look at what's happening in that country, there are amazing civil society organizations that are actually doing the work that would count as, say, pillar one, right? And so there's just so much that civil society and NGOs can do across the board. I think awareness raising is one thing, so that's really, really important because, as you probably realized again today, people just do not really understand what R2P is. Yeah. But secondly, across the board, in terms of preventive activities, if I think of women's groups in some African situations that I know of as well, who are doing the prevention work on the ground, right? Just incredible work. So, yeah, but I could go on.